Well, welcome to today's workshop. This is going to be a focus on really what I call the transdimensional sciences of the next millennium. And it's dealing essentially with where current knowledge of science meets the science of consciousness and contact experience, and puts all those things together so they make sense to people. And that's a really big task, because what you find normally with this subject is that it goes as far as, do UFOs exist? And people then want to kick the tires on the UFOs. Well, first of all, if they had tires and that kind of landing gear, it means it's made by Lockheed Martin and my uncle's old company, Northrop Grumman, and it's an anti-gravity device. Secondly, if it's only in this dimension, meaning 3D or 4D, if you count time is the fourth, then it isn't interstellar. So the first thing to get your mind around is to forget everything you know about conventional wisdom, if you've studied the UFO subject, but also what you know about conventional science, because they're both antiquated and have been purposely kept antiquated. I'll get into this in a moment. Dumbed down. And what I want to do is share what I think you and the public need to know to understand what has been called the phenomenon, this sort of meta-phenomenon of ET contact and UFO phenomenon that goes beyond just the fact that they're moving at 100,000 miles per hour and can make a right-hand turn without decelerating and not kill the pilots on board with 1,000 G-forces or whatever that would be, because that's all very interesting, but it kind of begs the question of, if they're interstellar, how'd they get here? And the fact that they're here a priori, they use something that's beyond even post-quantum physics. And this is a little bit like going back to Thomas Jefferson's era, which was only a couple of hundred years ago, and showing him this thing, a smartphone. And there'd be no foundation for understanding this. This would be metaphysical. So to the New Age people, they say, well, it's a metaphysical thing. Well, I said, well, what? What do you mean metaphysical? Metaphysical is just a term that people use when they don't quite understand the science of a phenomenon that's occurring. There is no metaphysical. It's all a level of consciousness of where you're coming from. So if you're an advanced civilization that's interstellar, by definition, you're transdimensional. So you're dropping out of linear space-time, and then you're reappearing at another point in space-time, but not in a straight line. And the comprehension of that requires a lot of humility on the part of humans, which we typically lack, but particularly scientists and theologians. We'll get to that a little bit later. There's people with spiritual understanding. Because the paradigm is one of where there is this nexus where what the physicist Goswami described as the self-aware universe comes together with post-quantum physics and way past spin theory and string theory, and where you begin to be very cognizant of the fact that these technologies that are interstellar are operating from a level of an understanding of the cosmos and reality that is one where consciousness and the mind is present at every level, even the 3D level, because it's the only thing that explains the phenomena and all the different manifestations. So I use this term TDIS, transdimensional interstellar, and so I just want to introduce that right off the bat. So TDIS is a term that I use for what we're dealing with when we look at the science of consciousness and the physics of how the spacecraft move, operate in our space, but also go from one star system to another. And of course, in the aerospace industry, they have more colorful terms for this. I was flying last year to Australia, and I was put beside a man going from Sydney to Brisbane, who was a Northrop Grumman engineer. I said, oh, it's my uncle's old company. My uncle worked on the lunar module, the thing that landed on the moon with Neil Armstrong in it. And he says, oh yeah, that's really cool. And I said, yeah. He was a young engineer. And he said, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm here for a meeting. He says, oh. I said, kind of dealing with some of the stuff that you may or may not deal with. And I just opened the door a little bit. He says, oh yeah, we know what, we call that PFM. I said, what? He said, pure fucking magic. And so, his words, not mine, although I did repeat them, redact, but that is why it's called PFM. But at the CIA, it's called WSFM. Have you all heard this term before? First time I heard it, it was from the science director, a guy who's one of the top guys in the science director at CIA, who's actually been encouraged me to do what I've been doing since 1992, because he can't, because they'll get assassinated. So he says, you do it. If you get assassinated, who cares? And so they use this term WSFM, sounds like a radio station. It stands for Weird Science and Frickin' Magic. And that is what they call this. In the Naval Research Lab, people call it that. Because what it deals with is a type of phenomenon that when you get into a certain level of very high voltage systems, where the voltage is at a certain frequency and resonant field. And I'm not going to bore people with the arcana of this, but let's say you have a Poynting vector, or you put an energy field with very high voltage around an object that's a couple million volts, but very, very low amperage. So there's not much power involved, but at a certain cycles per second, or hertz, resonant, and in specific resonant field, that object can be made to literally begin to resonate and then tilt out of linear space-time, and it will disappear. Now, I've been in a lab that's run near the Redstone Arsenal in Alabama, Huntsville, where this stuff has been done, and so by humans. So it's disappeared. You can't see it, and it actually has moved into another dimension 6, 10, 12, 80, 90, whatever it is. Someone asked me, how many dimensions are there? I said, how many numbers are there between 0 and infinity? Okay, so forget about 11 dimensions, or it keeps going. So, it's like infinity goes back to infinity. We're going to get into this later. And so the science behind this has really been studied somewhat accidentally in the early days by Faraday, Maxwell, Tesla, and it was sort of an empiricist understanding. You know what empiricism is. Empiricism is basically observational, science. You observe something, it's empirical, it's tangible. Now, you may not know the theoretical behind it. And this happens in science all the time. We'll see something, and we can describe the phenomenon, and even the parameters of the science, but we won't understand really what it's doing. We still don't really understand how, from the herb foxglove, a digitoxin works to increase the contractile strength of the heart muscle. But it's been used for 100 years. And it wasn't until very recently they understood how aspirin worked, which was from the bark of a tree, is where you get aspirin from. They didn't understand how that really worked. And they still don't understand all of how it works, but you can use it and empirically see how it works. But the understanding unfolds over sometimes decades, centuries, millennia. So I'm going to be talking about areas of science that is through a glass dimly, and that there are certain phenomena that we can observe, but the actual full understanding of it is probably going to be unfolding over the next 1,000, 5,000, 500,000 years. The whole next cycle we're in. So that's I want to set the stage there. And the other part of setting the stage is the humility needed to start approaching a subject like this. Because the biggest mistake people make is to think, we know everything. I know everything because I'm a physicist at MIT. Well, actually, not. It's like the guy, it's like the guy who in the late 1800s declared that we could close the patent office because everything that could be invented had been. Now, this is a true story. So, there's this hubris that goes with the human condition that's rather worrisome, which has led to the foolishness that we see today called human society. But so to get past that foolish way of thinking, there has to be a very open mind and also willing to admit that we really don't understand but a tiny fraction of the cosmos around us. And the brightest and best amongst us, working their whole lifetimes, can only unfold a little bit of it. And so from that foundation of sort of humility, then we can go and explore. And if we don't understand something, you just file it and say, well, someday we may understand this. But don't discount it. Because it's often the things that are discounted because it's not fitting into the box of the current paradigm of science or religion or thought that gets chucked out. And that's where the good stuff is. That's the really good stuff. And often people who do begin to explore those things get persecuted. Like the University of Virginia. We have our farm out near University of Virginia. And there was a medical doctor who discovered that there was a bacteria, H. pylori, that causes a lot of the really bad bleeding ulcers. And it ran against the theory that it was just too much acid. And that if you took a course of this and that medicine instead of the acid medicine or with it, it would cure them without surgery or anything. He got run out of the country, ended up in Australia. Australia was the only place he could get a job. He ended up getting the Nobel Prize. But the initial reaction of the scientific fundamentalist paradigm, the high priests of science, were to say, no, it can't be because we know everything about how this works. Well, it turns out they didn't know anything about how ulcers worked. So the same is true in physics, the same is true in materials, and the same is true in theological thought and consciousness studies. So I think that's why we have to sort of enter this whole subject with that kind of perspective. Then you can at least begin to explore with something resembling an open mind and learn something. The other thing to understand is that almost everything that I'm going to talk about today has been known in some classified project or another for a very, very long time. But in pieces, maybe not put together the way I'm going to present it. My job is to sort of synthesize it and connect the dots, which is my job today, is really to connect all these dots for you guys. So that you leave here understanding, wow, that's why an ET craft does that, or that's why I had this experience in a contact moment, or that's what the future of energy and technology is going to be, and a deep understanding. Now, what I will try to avoid is too much technical jargon, because this is not a group of physicists, but and I'm just a country doctor from Virginia anyway, so we'll sort of avoid. That's my line when I've done things at the Pentagon. I'm just a country doctor from Virginia. But you have to, feel in your heart that the knowledge can be understood even if it's not in all the technical aspects, the concepts. So if you get the concepts, then you can move into what I call an operational paradigm. And the operational paradigm means that you can put together the phenomenon you see and your own experience and consciousness and thought and do something with it. Which, of course, the outgrowth of that is the CE5 initiative, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, where humans use consciousness and thought to interface with interstellar communication systems and make contact. And that's the really exciting stuff. let's start with some of the observed phenomenon of these ET craft. If you go to SiriusDisclosure.com, SIRIUS disclosure.com. So at SiriusDisclosure.com, we have 5-6 dozen military witnesses' testimony up there. We have the Orion Project links to all these sort of papers, but there's a lot of information from these witnesses of things that they observed, such as pilots who'd be flying along, and there would be a spacecraft off their wing, and it didn't just fly off. It dematerialized, quote unquote, instantly right there on radar and just vanished. Well, it's not like they were hallucinating, because it was on radar and ground radar and onboard radar. This is what happened also, by the way, with the famous Alaska case, where the Japan Airlines 747 Heavy was flying the polar route from Paris to Tokyo, carrying champagne and whatever else they carry on cargo jets from Paris. And they had this massive spacecraft appear. And it was the size of a battleship, but it was in the sky. And it actually was a CE-5 in the sense that the pilot signaled to it, put the landing lights on, and the craft signaled back. So there was contact. A lot of people don't know that. You read the case of the captain, the Japan Airlines captain's account. Well, the spaceship, and this is all on our site and in the book Disclosure, the captain called in, and had it on its radar, and called it in, and of course it ended up being on FAA radar, which we eventually, from John Callan, got the FAA tapes, and also a military radar. Military jets were scrambled. But this massive object did not move in a linear way. What do I mean by that? Well, it would be, say, at 12 o'clock, and instantly it would then be at 6 o'clock. This is something that was many times the size of 747. And it moved in this non-linear way. And they could not understand it. First, they thought the radar was malfunctioning. That's what you go to immediately, because normally you track, even if you're tracking, a B-2 stealth or something that's supersonic, it's very linear. I mean, even 4 times the speed of sound is pretty slow. Or the space shuttle at 25,000 miles per hour is pretty slow. You can track that thing. This is not trackable. So in a linear way, because it would be here and then here. How? I'll get to this. And by the way, the same thing happened. Merle Shane McDowell, who's one of our witnesses, who was down here in Virginia at Norfolk at Atlantic Command, and he was working under the SYNC Atlantic Command, the Commander-in-Chief Atlantic Command, Admiral Harry Train. And they had a what's called full zebra alert, where basically, if you don't have a zebra stripe on your badge, you got to get out of the command center within 60 seconds or you're shot by the Marines who have the M16s there to enforce that. Now, I've been at this facility in that area, and they mean business when you're in there. And so they went to full zebra alert. The Admiral came down into his observation area, and this huge facility. And they had this ET craft on radar off the coast of Newfoundland. Boom, one radar sweep, it'd be off the coast of South Florida. One radar sweep, boom, it'd be right off the coast of Norfolk. And then it went off over to the Canary Islands, et cetera, and so on. Well, they actually did scramble jets when it was in one area, I think up in the Northeast, and got close enough to take photos. So the photos got classified and put into the Black Pit of Calcutta, never to be seen again. But daytime, there's a daytime event. But the movement on the radar clearly showed that it was this very large, it's several hundred feet, they estimate maybe the size of a football field, circular object, and that's how it was moving. Now, this is not your granddad's Oldsmobile. Clearly not using a jet engine or a rocket or anything like that. So, people say, what are the cases where you have proof of this? I said, well, we have the observation, we have the radar tapes, we have the documents, we have, what do you want? But what's behind the phenomenon is stop for a minute and say, how is it doing this? Well, it little gets into what Einstein called the spooky effect. Everybody know what spooky effect is? Well, Einstein observed that a particle could be in 2 places at once, like that. the same thing. And so he couldn't really explain it, but he just called it spooky, the spooky effect. And I guess it was spooky if you were linear in your thinking and teleologic and Einsteinian. But it's not spooky when you think about it. The whole cosmos is actually non-local because it's conscious. A few years ago, there was a journal, physics journal, that published, and it was actually on the front page of Newsweek. It was back in the late 80s, early 90s, where they did a study. And what they were doing is that they were studying photons and shooting them down an area, and there would be an aperture or a window that it would go through. But what happened is that the physicists found that when they thought of where they were going to move, the photons changed course precognitively. In other words, the photons reacted with the thought and consciousness and intent of the physicists. And this was done over and over again and proven. And this was published in mainstream physics journals. But people say, oh, well, that's interesting. Well, I don't know what it means. They chucked it aside. Again, it's the cool stuff that gets chucked aside. This is in the mainstream physics journals. You look this study up. And then, of course, you have people like Dr. Bob John of Princeton, the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, the PEER lab. And back in the 90s, he and I spoke about this. And he says, you know what you're doing out under the stars is sort of in a clinical, experiential way what I'm proving in the lab. And that is that everything is conscious and everything can react to thought and consciousness. And so what he did at Princeton, he was professor emeritus of engineering, and some of his work has been continued by some of his students, is that he would have like a random number generator, like a machine that just generates zeros and ones or something like that. And they'd have someone just sit, and it wasn't like this was some psychic or somebody, it just ordinary people, and they would put their intention on it that it would, instead of putting out zeros, would put out more ones. And sure enough, the bell curve distribution would shift. Or the other way. But what was really cool about it, he then found that if there were two people who were really connected to each other, loved each other, where there was a heart connection, and did it together, the effect was exponential, 10 times greater. So what is that? And this is a mechanical system. It's just a thing spitting out zero in the random number generator. And this has been proven over and over and over and over and over again. Now, there's no linear contact between the person's body, the physical 3D, 4D, and the machine. It's just purely thought, intending, and yet it affects it. What does this mean? Well, it means that everything is awake. Everything has within its structure an element of this non-local consciousness, mind that isn't bound to 3D space-time. And so non-locality is something that began to be talked about by physicists, and then there's a medical doctor, a man that I actually met once, and he wrote a wonderful book called Recovering the Soul. And it was all these accounts of scientists and also lay people finding that the mind and thought was always an omnipresent field and could have effects, whether it was like an intercessionary prayer for someone, one person would be in Europe, the other person in Hawaii, and they would have an effect, et cetera, and so on. Or they would take saliva, which has your white blood cells in it, and they take it to another continent, keep it alive in a petri dish, and they would put electrodes, and those white blood cells would register when the person had an emotional reaction to something consistently, even though it was out of their body. Cool. I mean, this is the really cool stuff. So, is everybody understanding this? I haven't lost too many people yet. And what that means, the real kind of the bullet point is, the mind is always omnipresent. Your mind, my mind, all mind, because there's a singularity of mind. Erwin Schrödinger, the father of modern quantum mechanics, it was really particle wave theory back, I think it was 1908, said the total number of minds in the universe is one. That is, it's a singularity. So mind stuff, or consciousness, is a singularity. Now, we can be aware of our own awareness and think, well, I'm conscious and I'm Steve, and you attach it to yourself and your ego or your individuation, let's call it, your individuality. However, it's always at the same time without any effort, whether you know it or not, tied into this sort of omnipresent non-local field of consciousness, as it turns out, without effort. Now, you can be shut off from that, or you can be tied into it. The meditative state and samadhi is when you get tied into the universal component. That's all meditation is. It's the quieting of the individual mind to where you experience the non-local mind, the unbounded mind. And this actually has profound implications not only for health and healing and contact, as we'll get to, but in physics. Because if you look at the cosmos, everything is in fact consciousness phasing and resonating as a photon or a star or a person or an individual or a tree. Now, this is not pantheism. It's an understanding that's a transcendent understanding of this sort of universality of the awake state, the awareness. And this has been proven scientifically. This is not, there have been study after study after study, some of which I'm citing here. I don't want to belabor the point. You can look these up yourselves. I'm sure you can all know how to read. But I want to pull it together into sort of an awakening within yourself of the fact that you're just not limited to your physical body and self, even when you think you are. We have one of our witnesses who's a Lockheed Skunk Works scientist, and you know what skunk works are? You know, the super secret skunk works up in the high desert. Where Ben Rich, he wrote the book Skunk Works, and before he passed away, he's the one who said, well, he said several things. One thing he said, there are no private conversations anywhere on Earth. This was in the 90s, so he was way ahead of Edward Snowden. Number two, anything you can imagine, we've already done at the Skunk Works. And number three, we already have the technologies to go travel amongst the stars. In fact, we can take E.T. home. And the last thing he did in his slide was to show this black disk going out into space. And it was a human. It was a man-made electromagnetic EMG anti-gravity disk, which they have, and which we have had since October 1954, when we mastered gravity control. But the more profound thing is that people who've studied this begin to have experiences that are very, very strange. Because you can take these electronics and create this lifter effect of anti-gravity. So they're called lifters. And the way it is done is that at a high enough voltage with a counter-rotating field, you can cause lift. And this is if you go all the way back to the experiments of T. Townsend Brown, who, of course, ended up being the guy at the starting of the RAND Corporation. His stuff went to the Air Force, went black. Or the Klasky-Frost experiment in late 20s in Germany. They were doing things with crystalline structures, and they would create a high voltage field around them, and found that, especially with crystals, they would kind of begin to resonate and expand, grow, or take up more space, and then they'd float and lift. 20s. 1920. I mean, before any of us were, I suspect before any of us were alive. I don't think there's anyone here who was alive in the 28 and 29 time period. Not even I. But so we have this amazing heritage that unfortunately has been confiscated into covert programs. But the people that I've dealt with, I now have over 500 people I've met with, like the guys at Lockheed Skunk Works and Northrop and the agencies, three-letter agencies, who've shared this with me. And the senior scientist here in the Naval Research Labs in DC, which is the largest Department of Defense lab, was in, quote, the vault and saw the documents that October 1954 is when we completed all the studies for gravity control. So we haven't needed rockets, jets, cars, trains, buses, trucks, ships on the ocean using combustible fuels or nuclear power since October 1954. Now, it was being studied before then for a couple of decades, but it was mastered. That's when they mastered gravity control. And what a shame it is. You look at the world, and we're destroying the world geopolitically and environmentally and every other way because of this secrecy. And the secrecy is something that I understand but do not agree with. You have to understand it. You don't have to agree with it. And I understand it in a compassionate way. I mean, I talked to the colonel who was in charge of future technologies for the Air Force, a euphemism for not future, things we already have. It's always a double speak when you deal with the military. So this guy knew about this, and he said, you know, those things can be weaponized. I said, yes, you already have. They're already weaponized. I said, I can't tell you how many patients I took care of in the emergency department who were killed with knives, steak knives, butter knives, you can kill everything. I said, everything can be weaponized. The question is, do we let human society terminate fighting over the last barrel of oil and destroying the biosphere, or do we find a way to live together peacefully in an enforceable peace? Maybe it may be the peace of the chained dogs initially, because there are always going to be madmen out there, but allow these sciences to come out so we don't cannibalize the earth. Because we're 100 years into a period when everything I'm telling you should have been known and out, at least in terms of the theoretical physics, the applied free energy materials should have been out by the turn of the last century, early 1900s, and the electromagnetogravitics 40s and 50s, which of course Werner von Braun was working on with Adolf Hitler in Germany. That was their secret weapon. We were doing the atomic bomb, they were doing anti-gravity. But we have this period in our history right now where we've sort of gone past the red line of disclosure, where we should have had these things disclosed and put into peaceful application before I was born, because I was born in 1955. So I think that when we look at this, we have to say, you know, it's a little bit like Gloria Steinem when she used to say, the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. Love it. Love it, love it, love it. But we're at this point, we're going to have to decide to make these changes, but first we have to understand what we're dealing with here. And we really have to begin to understand the power of the conscious mind and these technologies and how they come together. Because when we're out there making contact with these civilizations, we're actually pulling together amazing science and technology, even though you may not fully understand, but the things that are happening are amazing. And therefore the phenomena that can happen are amazing. And that's why you need this understanding, this scientific and intellectual understanding to understand the experience you will have or may have already had and didn't understand what happened when you had it. Like when you had that at the Outer Banks. That's why the men who've worked in these projects and some of the women, like this guy at the Lockheed Skunk Works, he knew about some of this, but not all of it. He knew more about just the more mainline anti-gravity stuff, or electromagnetogravitic, because that's the proper term. Anti-gravity, sort of a pop culture term. It's incorrect. It's not anti-gravity. It just creates a mass cancellation effect of an object so it floats. And if you cancel the mass enough, think about it. If you create a voltage around an object where the mass becomes less and less and less, what happens when the mass goes to zero? It disappears. Correct. It vanishes to the eye and all detection systems, and it's then moved into another dimension. And it's in that state that it goes from this star system to another one. Get it? Does this make sense to people? Now this is beginning to make sense. So when these pilots and people come to me with these spirits, now they're going to come with an empirical observation, and they don't have the background. I will try to explain to them why that 747 and this massive craft went from here to here and looked like it vanished, or the one that's going on your wingtip was hovering there, and all your instruments were going nuts on board, and it just dematerialized and vanished. There's nothing metaphysical about it. It's an actual hard science, a very well understood hard science, but it's not something you can take at a course at MIT. So this is your MIT course. So for now, someday, this will be mainstream education. I hope soon. Maybe not soon, but the sooner the better. The kids coming along need to understand this. This particular scientist, getting back to his experience, the reason he called me up was not to tell me about the time he was operating a radar system and an ET craft came in and did all this amazing stuff, which is in the disclosure book. It was that he had an experience that he didn't understand, a personal experience. This is why a lot of these guys end up getting in touch with me. It's very funny. And I go, okay. So I'm on the phone. I think he heard me on a radio show or something, and so he says, well, Doc, I was practicing a meditation discipline back in the 60s called Rosicrucians or something like that. Yeah, the Rosicrucian. And he was trying to learn how to, what they call astrally project, where your body of light and consciousness sort of lifts up out of your physical body and flies around, like a lucid flying dream, but sort of on command instead of accidentally. And I said, oh, cool. You ever have any success with that? He says, yes, let me tell you. And he says, but it has to do with this issue. I said, oh, really? And so he said, well, I was there and I was trying too hard. He wasn't relaxing deeply enough. And so his teacher one day said, look, you know how to do this. You just need to let go and let it happen. And I guess the right thing was said to him, so he was able to do it. So he lay down on his bed and he was doing whatever technique they use. I've never taken that course, but he went out of his body, lifted up, and initially just kind of lifted up, and then he got so excited, he went right up through the roof, the ceiling of the house, and into the sky and into the atmosphere, and then slammed into the side of an extraterrestrial vehicle. Now, he's fully lucid awake. And he said that the ETs on board, which were around 4 or 5 feet tall and very thin, no hair, were at some control, and they were observing. And they were hovering in the atmosphere, but not visible to the eye because they were shifted into this other dimension. And when he hit the spacecraft, the craft moved, but it was not his physical body, it was his astral body. The body of light that you fly around in. And he says, I don't understand how an interstellar vehicle, because he knew they existed, could be affected. I said, because it had shifted its resonant frequency beyond the crossing point of light, the speed of light and matter and electrons, into a dimension that closely approximates the astral body field, that energy field that the mystics called astral. And since it was of a similar density to your own, it could interface with it. The funniest part of the story, after he said, oh, I've wondered my whole life how that could have happened. He popped inside and they looked at him like, my God, why don't you watch where you're going? They did. It was kind of like appalled at this interstellar faux pas. And like, well, you can watch where you're going, How many people have had a flying dream where it's like full color and you're flying along? All right, that's your astral body. And the mystics call it your astral body. But it's actually it's part and parcel woven into your physical body, but you can have experiences where it separates. And you can travel through that modality to other places, other dimensions. And this has been done for thousands of years. There's many, many accounts in the literature about people doing this. And many people will confuse that with their actual physical body because it looks very similar in shape and size. But then within that astral body is the sort of the essence of your self, your thought essence. And then within that is pure consciousness. So if you look at it, every single individual human being has folded within them all the dimensions of the cosmos. So when people say, how do I explore and find these other dimensions? I said, they're already folded within you. They're there. It's just that you just need to have someone explain that that's what that is. So anyway, so this this Skunk Works guy, the Lockheed Skunk Works, was very happy to finally figure out what happened. But then we had this discussion, and I said, this has really profound implications for you understanding what's going on at Dreamland MOC. And you know what Dreamland MOC is? Okay, so I brought with me the thing I put together when Obama got elected. And the very first document in this briefing is the one from Nellis Air Force Base. What the public call Area 51. Nobody calls it that. And it talks about the Dreamland MOC in it, Dreamland, and all the different compartments out at that facility. And the reason there was an area called Dreamland is that when the pilots who were piloting these anti-gravity devices, and they were taking them to the edge of the crossing point of light, all right, right to the edge of going beyond the light barrier, resonantly. There is this phenomenon of beginning to dematerialize, and you find that you have shifted your body and the craft and everything in it, and it feels like a lucid dream, when you're awake in a lucid dream. And that's why it was called Dreamland, Military Operating Center, MOC. And a lot of people always wonder how they got Dreamland. Now you know. This is something that if you begin to look at, if you do an ethnography of different cultures, for example, the Aboriginals in Australia, where they have something called dream time. And I know a man who worked for ONI, the Office of Naval Intelligence and State Department. His cover was State Department, he was really ONI. And he went over there to study this. And so he went out into the outback, this was back in the 70s, I think. And he kind of embedded himself with a group of Aboriginals who were still in touch with that ability. And they were talking to him about dreams. So, one night they, were in some encampment and they were very nomadic, went to sleep. And one of the members of the tribe, one of their Aboriginals the next morning said, "Oh, well, I had a very lucid, in the dream I met so-and-so, I don't know the person's name, and we need to walk and meet at whatever time here." And of course this guy who was a State Department / Naval Intelligence person studying this weird high strangeness didn't quite believe it. And so they started trekking. And sure enough, at the exact place and time, he met this person and they didn't have cell phones, nothing. And they just met. And he said, this is, So it was one of these things where this is their normal state. And many African tribes have described doing this, and Native American peoples, and they call them seers or visionaries. But it's really just the capability of the conscious mind to be disciplined in the dream state, sleep state, to awaken into this dream, and then be in control while you're having it. That's the lucid part, and begin to explore. And you can explore things in this world or other worlds that way. Now, really what we do when we do the Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind protocols is that we're going into deep meditation and doing it consciously. We're not going to sleep. Well, some people go to sleep because we're out till 2 in the morning. But we're doing this through a technique, a meditative technique and a protocol, which you can all use and practice. And practice makes perfect. I'll tell you, you need to practice it for it to really work effectively. But the concept is what you need to understand. How does it work? Well, if you're talking about connecting to an interstellar civilization, they may or may not be in the area and not in this linear dimension. Maybe they're dematerialized and they're hovering over the White House. Could be. Why not? Who would detect it? Nobody would detect it if it's shifted far enough out of this dimension. But it could pop into view instantly. So it's not just that they're traveling faster than the speed of light. They can be shifted beyond the speed of light and be, quote, stationary, but kind of superimposed around this space, but beyond 3D space. Does that make sense? So it could be in this room. It could be anywhere. Now, the effect, it becomes something that doesn't make a lot of sense to people unless they understand the basic concepts I'm sharing now. And then you say, well, what happens when it's only partially here? So let's say there's a spacecraft and it's not quite 3D, but it's near, but it's shifting, it's bumping up against the fabric of space-time. Well, this is where you get all kinds of epiphenomenon, all kinds of other phenomena, such as electromagnetic signals coming through our systems that we detect, a sphere that floats right by us out in the desert, which happened to Joshua Tree a few years ago, stopped and we heard 4 voices speaking in the desert in clear air, empty. We had night scopes. And then all of a sudden we took a photograph and here's this extraterrestrial we call Bijou, who's from the Andromeda galaxy, who's there waving. It's on the website. Okay? That's how that happened. But it actually, so the understanding of this, it's really key to going out and doing the contact protocols. Because you're using consciousness, but you're also using thought and electromagnetic systems, and all of this is coming together in a nexus. And there can be all degrees of the manifestation or how something materializes. It can be 3D, where you really would bump into it solid, or it may look like it's 3D, but you could walk right through it. Wonderful story from Altus Air Force Base. A friend of ours who lives out in the mountains, he worked for the Air Force back in the 60s, and he was a guard at a nuclear bomb squadron out in Oklahoma. And if you read his account, it's very interesting because there was roughly a chevron or triangular shaped object that was cobalt blue, gorgeous, that came into, and they were investigating our nuclear capabilities. I think this was in 1968. I have to look it up. But it's in the testimony. You can look. But what was interesting is that he said it was translucent cobalt blue. It wasn't solid. But you could see the shape of it, but it wasn't fully like that. Does that make sense? So it moved over, and of course they have what they call the hot areas that are marked off in red. No one can go into those hot areas except the pilots for the nuclear bombers. And of course these were hot, ready to go. They were kept ready to go all the time in those days. And we still have some that are hot, ready to go. But the hot areas were, and they had sensors, electromagnetic sensors. Well, as this thing moved across that area, it set the sensors off. So even though it wasn't 3D, totally physical, visually you could see this outline of this cobalt blue ship. And it was enough in this dimension to put off electromagnetic fields that the electronic sensors went off, which ended up being a disaster because they went to a full alert and had to scramble those jets and move them off the base, which is what happened. But the craft was never 3D, fully 3D. Does this make sense? So many times people will see something and they'll go, well, I saw it, but I'm not sure. And in fact, that's how this guy approached me. I'm not sure what and I said, well, just describe it. Don't editorialize it. And he described it. I said, oh, well, I know exactly what that is. That was a craft of that shape and dimension that was still shifted. Its molecular and atomic structure, resonant field, was still shifted high enough that it wasn't totally 3D, but you could see the glow and outline of it, kind of like an astral body or a ghost. Cool stuff, huh? Is this too much information too quickly? Okay, so we're going to have a whole hour and a half of question and answer for later anyway, so make notes on your little tablets or whatever you want to do if you have questions that come to your mind. The reality is, when we're observing ETs, their physical bodies can also do the same thing. So if you look at this ET we call Bijou that appeared at Joshua Tree National Park, we're probably going to do a week training there in April if you want to come. We go to this place, it's amazing, in the heart of this 800,000 acre park. And was that with the naked eye, nothing was seen. Now, the ears could hear 4 ETs speaking. I don't know what language they were speaking. Andromedan? I don't know. But when the person took the photo, Raven, a member of our team, took the photo, she just held her breath and had it open for 3 or 4 seconds, and here is this glowing field of energy and this being standing there, turned like this, waving at us. And on the top of his head, if you look very carefully, is what looks like a yarmulke. It's not. I don't think he's Jewish. It might be. There's a rabbi from Andromeda. No. But it's this thick. It's about this. It looks about that thick, and it's a white, and it's basically a teleportation assisting device. So it holds that field. So their physical body can phase in and out of 3D or 5D, 10D, whatever, resonantly shifting. Make sense? I'm looking around to see if I've lost everyone yet. Because understanding all of this, I'm trying to give examples of things that are really big lessons to understand when you're going to go out into the stars with your team in Largo or wherever, or California, or wherever you're from. Now, the other more fascinating part of this is that interstellar civilizations utilize what I call coherent thought emanating from a deep level of quiet mind that's very directional, very specific, the way we would utilize a laser and a laser disc, or a fiber optic system with lasers, or a laser tracking system. There's a really hilarious story I like to share about meeting with the CIA director for Bill Clinton out here at a dinner party some years ago, about 20 years ago. And of course, the interest was policy. Why the hell why the hell isn't the president being told what's going on? Why are they lying to us? I'm the CIA director and I don't know nothing about this. And so we got through all that. And then we got into more of a relax. It was almost 3 hours we were together. My wife was with me. And the wife of the CIA director was the chief operating officer of the National Academy of Sciences over here. So she had a really scientific mind, whereas the CIA director was more policy. Secrecy, policy, all that. And basically upset and mad because they had looked into the issue and knew they were being lied to, which is what, of course, the whole Clinton team knew that, and so did Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter famously said, "I didn't have a high enough security clearance to be told about this," even though he had had a sighting as governor of Georgia. But so she basically said, "Well, I don't understand. How could they be communicating from one star system Let's say they're from a star system way out there, and they're trying to communicate with a craft that's here, one of these UFOs that's here. How could they possibly do that? Because the electromagnetic field is the speed of light. You know, that's what your cell phone is. Radios, 186,000 miles per second, speed of light. And I said, yes, I know, the speed of light is just too damn slow, isn't it? I said, well, they're not. They're using a phased electromagnetic system that goes beyond the crossing point of light. And by the way, the chief scientists in Naval Research Lab said they have done experiments at NRL here that have done signals beyond the speed of light, but it is classified. He sat in my condo here and told me this word for word. Number 3 at the whole lab. Sits in on meetings with the vice president. I mean, I know this guy stayed at our home. This is real. So, but she didn't know about this because she was an administrator at the National Academy of Sciences. And I said, well, you know, my first thought was if I tell her the truth about this, she's going to think I'm a crank and a kook. And, you know, I'm a young doctor. I'm only 35 or something. And I have 4 children I got to put through college. I said, I'm going to ruin myself if I tell her the truth. And, but I thought, well, you know, she asked me the question and I owe her an honest answer. And so I said, look, you've asked, but bear me out. I said, you know, let's take our Milky Way galaxy. The Milky Way galaxy is 100,000 light years across. So if a beam of light went across at 186,000 miles every second, it would take 100,000 years to reach the other side. That's just our galaxy. And in our galaxy is about 100 billion star systems. Same number of star systems that there are neurons in our brain. Cool, huh? Interesting coincidence. And let's just say there's a civilization that is 1,000 light years from here. A light year is a distance, not time measurement, a distance measurement. It's the distance light goes at 186,000 miles a second in a year. So let's say it's 1,000 light years from here, which is 1% of the way across the Milky Way galaxy, which means it's in our neighborhood, because we're not even intergalactic now. At the speed of light of your cell phone, a radio wave, a TV signal, a fiber optic, it's going to take 1,000 years for the signal to get from that home planet to their starship that's in our solar system, and another 1,000 years for the starship to say, hi, got your message, how are you doing today, to go back. It's the time since the birth of Christ, so to say hello and goodbye. It's not a functional paradigm. So a priori, if you're interstellar, you are transdimensional. And what does that mean? It means that your communication gear, as well as your transportation gear, is dropping out of linear space-time in a non-locality, a field of non-locality. Now, the ultimate field of non-locality is pure mind stuff, the essence of awareness. But that's absolute non-locality. But between the absolute field of non-local, pure, undifferentiated consciousness and 3D are countless numbers of gradations of relative non-locality. And they may not be instant, but they're pretty damn fast, and they're certainly faster than the speed of light. Is this making sense to people? Okay, stay with me. So this means that they have electronic devices that are, when they're fully materialized 3D, have electronics that can pick up on directed thought and transmit directed thought. And I'll never forget Dr. Robert Woods, who is one of our witnesses from McDonnell Douglas, telling me a story, old man McDonald. I know this from 2 sources, Lawrence Rockefeller, who was very interested in all this, and who funded the original Project Starlight effort. The AP had this whole release of Project Starlight documents from the Clinton Library. It was a big scandal a couple years ago when we were putting all this stuff together, and Lawrence Rockefeller was involved, and his lawyer, Henry Diamond, and all these big folks, and I was putting together all this stuff, but he funded the first gathering of witnesses at Silomar near Monterey in California in 1995. We had KGB people there and cosmonauts and astronauts and everybody. And what was interesting is that this whole group of people kind of understood this area of thought and consciousness, but not too technically. And what we discovered was that through going back, this was I believe in the mid-60s, McDonnell Douglas was very interested in this. And old man McDonald himself was like, oh, I've got to know about this. So Dr. Woods, who is a very renowned aerospace guy, was sent to research all this stuff. Anti-gravity, UFO sightings, all this stuff. And he came back with this amazing case of a very high caliber case, where I think it was in the Baja California, where a craft had materialized, and this was back before we had systems to track them so well and hit them with electromagnetic weapons, which is what's happening today. We'll get to that. And this little being came out, and it had like a little black box thing here. And it was obviously the communication device. And the people who had the encounter said that basically the ET was communicating directly into their neural cortex, and maybe auditory cortex, with this thing in thought. And that when they would think back to the being, they wouldn't have to speak, he would understand it and receive it. And so it was if you will, a thought transponder instead of a radio transponder. And now, this sounds like science fiction, but it isn't. It's the only thing that can explain how you're going to scientifically and reliably be able to have a communication system that is from one star system or galaxy to another in real time. Again, spooky effect, two things at once, boom, boom. So you're dropping out of the linear barrier of space. And it's basically space is obliterated, if you wish, to look at it that way, so that it's all right here. You can be a billion light years away and it's still right here because of the non-local effect of consciousness and understanding that other aspects of reality have a conscious component, including photons, electrons, and electromagnetic signals. There's a carrier wave of thought stuff, consciousness stuff, even within an electromagnetic signal. Get it? That's why the CE5 initiatives actually do work. And when I explained some of this, finally the wife of the CI director said, oh, I thought it had to be something like that. What was her response? I said, yeah, of course, you're a smart lady. I mean, it makes sense. Now, in polite company, polite scientific company, one's not allowed to talk about these things because it's forbidden. This is like my book, Hidden Truth, Forbidden Knowledge, that the film series was based on. These are things you're just not allowed to talk about because it's so paradigm busting scientifically and even theologically, because it begins to explain a lot of, quote, mystical experiences people have had that become a catechism or get misinterpreted through the millennia. But ultimately, if we want to seek the truth, let's find the truth and forget our dogma. I love that saying, my karma ran over my dogma, or something like that. That's really, the pure-hearted pursuit of the truth, no matter where it takes you, is really, really key when you're going into these emerging sciences and areas of thought and consciousness. This then brings us to the numbers of people who have observed these kinds of phenomenon in the mainstream, where they will have an object, a sphere, appear, and then inside the sphere, floating into their house, are these little beings in the sphere, communicating in their thought. A very famous actor, who I've spent time at his home in LA, had this happen. Didn't think any of this was true. And then, of course, he found out who I was, bought all the books, and he said, oh my God, that's why this happened. Because he read the first book that I wrote, Extraterrestrial Contact, The Evidence and Implications. It came out in '99. Most people don't get to that book. It's really probably the most important one. And what was fascinating is that he said, now I understand it. So he contacted me, and I went to his home, and we were sitting where this happened, and then went out on his balcony, which overlooked Silver Lake Reservoir there in LA. And he was up in the hills. And here comes this object, comes straight down out of space, a yellow golden object, comes down, goes, and goes in front of a cloud, and then dematerializes. He goes, oh, did you see that? I go, yeah. I said, they know we're talking. I'm sure these are the same people who came into your house. Wonderful, lovely. So I think that a lot of people have had these experiences, but they don't have the understanding. My hope for this gathering today, but also the video that we'll put out, is that people will begin to connect these dots and make some sense of these experiences. Where in the early days, when I started looking into this, I found there were many, many accounts where people would see a craft, or maybe it's not fully materialized, maybe it's just a sphere, and they'll think something, and it'll react to the thought. And people go, how is it doing that? It was reading my mind. Well, I mean, it's not Kreskin reading your mind. There is a science of what I call coherent thought receivers and transmissions that can take place between transdimensional interstellar capable civilizations and humans. Now, we may not understand all the science, and I can't say I can go to a laboratory and build one of these things, because I can't hook up my DVD player. Emily has to do that. I'm useless for that kind of thing. You know, he's like, nurse, or Emily, help. You know, but defibrillators, great, and respirators and other stuff. No, computers, hurl them through the window. I'm all thumbs. But, you know, we can understand it. So then, from an experiential point of view, from that paradigm, we can say, oh, I understand now how it is contact can be initiated, but also if it spontaneously begins to happen, how it begins to unfold, and why it can be both physical and in thought and electronic, and then in these other phenomenon. I call it the epiphenomenon that happens, all the different manifestations of contact. We're sitting out in the desert in the middle of an 800,000 acre park. There are no police around, there's no microwaves, there are no McDonald's, there are no big microwave ovens, and we have magnetic field meters and radar detectors and other things that aren't expensive, but that we have in our toolkit. And we're sitting there, and we'll see an object. It'll look like a flash bulb going off in space. It's just an object that turns on and turns off. And sometimes it'll move and turn on and turn off. And one time we had like 15 of them that were right above us doing this that we filmed. This actor actually came out with us near Palm Springs, and we did this. And then the detectors start talking. But they're making sounds that the people, if you contact the people who manufacture at the factory, go, these don't make these sounds. And they're actually doing trans-dimensional communication through the electronics. So forget the Arecibo telescopes and the SETI project spending hundreds of millions of dollars. You can go to Radio Shack, get a radar detector, a magnetic field meter, tri-field meter, and a couple other things, put that out, sit in meditative state, and then welcome them to come, and all kinds of things can start happening. And what is it? How do you interpret that, though? It becomes very intuitive. Because, and what we have found with some of our equipment, certain things will make certain tones. Like we have one radar detector we call Walter, because a man named Walter gave it to us. And it will do a certain type of beeping. It'll go beep, beep, beep 3 times, and only 3 times. Doesn't make the sound like you would with a cop car or a radar gun. Just when an object is about to appear. And then within moments, there'll be a sighting of an ET object. It'll beep, 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 and it means we are here. So you get into this flow, and they actually do what I call a trans-dimensional entrainment of the circuitry of your device. It gets customized after a period of weeks and months, years. And they really will communicate in ways that are quite mysterious, quite bizarre. People who come on these whole week thing expeditions with me, they go, "What the hell is going on?" I said, "Well, just listen and interpret for yourself." But there is a pattern to it that evolves. So you have objects that can materialize, objects that can be quasi-materialized, that are like the cobalt blue object at that Air Force Base. You can have spherical objects that will have the entities in them. You can have an object that appears and then dematerializes, and then all you hear is some voices speaking. You take a photograph, and there's this guy waving at you. This is why it's WSFM. Weird science and frickin' magic. And everyone is oriented towards very materialistic, linear, early 21st century manifestations, because that's what we want. And I'm saying, what a mistake. That's a huge mistake. Because what they're really wanting us to do is to understand their universe, their cosmos, and go partially into that. Because it's edifying. That's how you learn. You don't learn by having everything spoon-fed you at the level that you're already operating. Does this make sense? Hard lesson, because people are lazy. And humans tend to be kind of slovenly, mentally. It was a Yogananda that said it's the lack of spiritual adventuresomeness that keeps humanity back. So there's a sense of adventuresomeness and exploration, and these civilizations understand that we need to be kind of willing to step, while we're in this planet and in this dimension, step partially into their understanding of what it's like on their planet, where using thought to interface with an electronic device is as common a thing as we would be texting someone with our cell phones. But remember, a few hundred years ago in Salem, Massachusetts, if you had a smartphone, you'd be burned at the stake as a witch. It'd be witchcraft. It'd be magic. So that's why, if we're really looking at this, and instead of looking backward, if we want to look forward into where our civilization's headed, we need to take these lessons to heart and begin to practice it within that paradigm. And that's what we're encouraging people to do through these CE5, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind teams. Very, very exciting, because as you begin, we have an app that's at the app stores. It's for both iPhones and also Google, that you can get that has the whole meditation technique. It'll actually turn your phone into a magnetic field meter. It does all this stuff. It's a whole course. It's a huge file. You have to use your computer to download it. It's so big. But I encourage people to get that. We have people who've done that, gotten that, and who are in all kinds of remote areas of the world. And now that's separate from the app, the free app that lets you network with people in your area. That's the ET Contact Networking app. This is the training app. But it's only like $6.99, and it has like a zillion things in there. And I encourage people to get that, because if you can't come on a whole week expedition with me, and those are limited to 20 people, so let's face it, not many people can, but you can get that, practice it, find some people in your area, and go out and begin to do it. And when you go out and begin to practice it, then you realize, wow, this works. And we've heard from so many people go out and try it, and they go, we had an amazing object, we had amazing sighting, we had this thing come right into the field with us. And the reason it works is that it's so simple. Because the simplicity of it, even though what I'm giving you is more of a deeper theoretical and physics understanding of it, everyone's conscious, right? Well, unless you're in a coma. And everyone can think. And so if you are sentient, if you have the ability to be aware and awake, you can become aware of awareness. And in that self-aware state, you can go into the silence of deep, quiet mind. And in that state, begin to remote view and see distant places, including where the ET craft are. And they may be under the ground underneath you. They may be transposed in the air around you. They may be on the far side of Saturn. It doesn't matter where they are, because there's no limitation in space when you go into thought consciousness that goes beyond space-time. So that's where the meditative state is so key. And if you begin to understand what's there's this wonderful saying from I think it's a Sufi tradition, thinkest thyself a puny form when within thee the universe is folded. It's a rhetorical question. So we think of ourselves as just these little animals running around, but the truth is, every conscious being has the ability to be aware of the awareness itself, and from that point, explore anywhere and travel anywhere, see any place. And, human history is replete with people who've had these experiences, many times quite spontaneously. I think almost everyone has had. How many people here have had a precognitive or an intuitive experience of something that then happened in their life at some point? Yeah, I met my wife that way, in a lucid dream. And I think that what you find, it really did. But what you find is that this is something that is innate to every human being. It's not like you have to be, this guy I knew for years, Ingo Swann. You know who Ingo Swann is? Very famous remote viewer, did a lot of stuff for the intelligence community, lived to regret it. But I was at his home up in New York some years ago, and just a wonderful man, brilliant. And he did a lot of work with SRI, Stanford Research International, and DARPA, and Army Intelligence and CIA. And they were experimenting and training people during the Cold War to be able to use consciousness to spy on the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was doing the same thing. And everyone in the intelligence community at a certain clearance level knows about this, by the way. This is nothing, all that secret. It's hidden in plain sight. But what was interesting to me was that, he regretted that he ended up being used that way eventually. But what he and I would talk about together is the fact that every single human being has the ability to do this. They just don't do anything to help develop it. So it's like, you don't start out in kindergarten doing quantitative analysis and calculus. There's a process, right? It's the same thing with these capabilities. I bench press 410 pounds, but you don't start out that way. You rip your, pectoralis muscles in half. So so everything is an iterative learning, developing process of skill and knowledge and experience that builds on itself over time. Most people just never take the time to sit down 2-3 times a day, go into a quiet meditative state, and then practice the ability to intend to know. And I call it the intend to know because it's not brute will, it's quietly going into consciousness and then saying, I want to know this, or I want to see this place. And let it open very subtly. It's a very subtle, integrative process as opposed to a brutal intellectual one. My own approach to this is a very Vedic one. And as you know, the ancient Vedas, people conflate the Vedas with Hinduism. They have really very little to do with each other. The Vedic knowledge predates any known. It's a philosophy. But Vedanta is really the study of consciousness in its singularity. And that's, of course, from that, the concept of the human experiencing that state, which is called samadhi or nirvana. But there's this misunderstanding in the public that only certain adepts, that you have to lay on a bed of nails for 30 years and, do all kinds of crazy stuff to be able to have this happen. It simply isn't true. Every single human being can learn to sit quietly, go into a meditative state, using whatever works for you. I use a type of mantra meditation. It can also be a breathing technique with mantra. There are a lot of approaches to it. The key thing is for the mind to become quiet, centered, and allow it to become very deeply centered. And at the point where all thought and awareness of everything disappears, but you're not asleep, you're still awake, it may just be a flash. That's the samadhi state. It's the experience of pure consciousness without differentiation. That's the state of pure non-locality. At that point, you are omnipresent. You're everywhere. And it is at that point that if you begin to practice and experience that, you can stay very steady state in your awareness and then intend, while still being very quiet, to see or know something that's remote, like where a starship is, or what's going on at home in your kitchen. In my misspent youth, instead of doing drugs and chasing skirts, I was spending 8 hours a day meditating, doing Vedanta, when I was in my late teens and early 20s. And I had some experiences that taught me that this was really easy to do, because I just said, I want to learn how to do this. And I notwithstanding the fact I was raised a very devout atheist. I mean, we're very, the catechisms of atheism. Didn't fit in a test tube, didn't exist, end of discussion. But at the most, agnosticism. But after my near-death experience, when I was 17, I had an experience of that state of mind. It was beautiful. It was this supernal state. I'll never forget it. And I said, well, I really want to learn how to arrive at that state of deep peace and quiet and oneness, if you want to call it that, a sort of universal oneness, without having to die or have something terrible happen to me, which is what happened, and have a near-death experience. So I did. So I learned meditation, and it was very comical because here I am. It was on my 18th birthday. And I only tell this story not in any self-aggrandizing way, but just to give you a sort of a sense of how people entrain themselves to make things difficult when they shouldn't. So I didn't know that it was supposed to be so easy. I didn't know that it was supposed to be so hard. So I accepted it was natural and easy. So my teacher did the whole thing, and he initiated me, and I sat down, and I immediately went into this deep, deep, deep meditation, and I transcended into samadhi. And afterwards, he was looking at me sort of appalled. He says, you transcended, didn't you? I said, isn't that what we were supposed to do? And I didn't know that I was supposed to make this big gashrai about it, and make this big deal and have to waste 30 years doing something that you can do in 30 minutes. So that's another lesson. You need to sort of affirm to yourself, A, this can be done, and B, you can do it. If you think you can't do it, you won't. But if you say, of course, I'm awake now, why can't I close my eyes, or even with my eyes open eventually, be able to be in touch with the mind that is this omnipresent field? What Ernst Schrödinger said, the total number of minds in the universe is one. It's a singularity. So if you affirm to yourself you can do it, you will be able to do it. If you sit there with the little gremlin on your ego shoulder saying, I can't do it, I won't do it, I'm not Ingo Swann, I'm not the, blah, 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 poor me. Well, you're not. It's like, a doctor trying to put a chest tube in. If I have to put a chest tube in here because he's just been run over by a Mack truck and he's got a hemothorax, and I'm going, I can't do this. Well, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to lacerate all the nerves in his whatever before I get into where I need to be. So there's a certain amount where you have to give yourself a break and say, I can do this because I'm awake. And go back to some experience in your life that's been intuitive, or some experience in your life where you've experienced a lucid dream and then the next day it happened, and begin to recall these experiences where you go, I do have this aspect of the mind within me that is omnipresent. And I can go to that place and use it for good and to see things in real time that are going on now at distant places, but also I can see things into the future, or if I need to, into the past. Why? Because consciousness transcends not only linearity of space, it transcends the flow of time. And that solves the mystery of the precognitive lucid dream. Now, I'm a quarter Cherokee. My grandmother was Cherokee Indian, and their tradition is a big tradition of lucid precognitive dreaming, like at the Hopi, which I just learned actually were the people who, the Anasazi who disappeared, became the Hopi. And they would have these experiences of precognitively seeing the future in the dream state and in vision quests. And what you find is that that's something you can do also. Most of the very important close encounters of the fifth kind, where we were going to set out on an expedition to a foreign country or someplace a week before it would happen. Sometimes more than one of the people I was going to travel with would have a dream of an event that would happen and where the place looked like, even though it was a place we'd never been. And it would be crystal clear. It may just be a flash. It may just be an instantaneous flash. It may be in that hypnagogic state, the state in between waking and dreaming. That's a great time to practice this once you learn the science of consciousness, which I'm introducing you to here very quickly. So I went from aircraft sightings to this stuff. But this is what's really exciting. And at that point you go, wow, I can be in that relaxed state going in and out of meditation, but also in and out of sleep, and see a distant place, but also perhaps see a point in the future. Caveat. Anything that's in the future can only be a probable future. If it's in the past, it's kind of in chrysalid. It's there. It's in the Akashic record. It's there. If it's in the future, it's subject to change depending on what everyone, including yourself, thinks and does. And this is why when people say, on December blah blah of this year, X, Y, and Z is going to happen, I immediately know they're a charlatan. Because if they get that fixed in their predictions about soothsaying into the future, they don't understand the nature of reality and that it's this organic, evolving phenomenon that is subject to the thoughts and the actions of even those who have heard your prediction, including yourself. It's sort of like the Heisenberg, it's sort of a psychic Heisenberg principle. But so that is something you have to understand, that it may be 95% likely, 80% likely, 99.9% likely, but not 100% if it's off the now. Now, if it's in now in real time and you become accurate, boom, it's there now, be here now. Or if it's in the past. But when we're doing CE5 contact work, normally we do preparation before we go out. So I encourage people to practice this precognitive capability before we go out that night, for example. And I encourage people on their teams to do it. And then, but when you're there in real time, you're observing with your conscious mind and inviting these civilizations to come visit in real time, if they can, and if it's safe and everything, if it's an appropriate group. And we always do this within the context of not dolphins at SeaWorld jumping through hoops for us and entertaining us. We do it within the context of genuinely wanting to be ambassadors or emissaries from Earth and humanity to these civilizations without prejudice. So it's sort of a global diplomatic corps of interstellar travelers. That's what we're developing, who understand to get out of the sort of the orthodoxy and catechisms of conventional ufology, 99% of which is rubbish, and to step into being in a higher state of consciousness, making contact with these civilizations without fear and without prejudice about who they are and where they've come from. Or even perhaps what they've done in the past, because the past cannot... Let's look at it this way. No matter how you view these civilizations, the future is always different from the past. And we create the future now. Just remember that. Very important. I mean, a generation ago, they were dropping atomic bombs on Japan and blowing up every city in Germany. Now they're our closest allies. So humans need to learn to get out of the us versus them xenophobia. This sort of the negative end of atavistic proclivities. Returning to this sort of primitive monkey troop fighting, murderous, rampaging monkey routine. Because we can't afford that. Not with nuclear weapons and not with weapons that have been developed from studying extraterrestrial technologies, which are 1,000,000 times more powerful than a hydrogen bomb, which we have already. Scalar electromagnetic weapons. So that means that there need to be a core of us who are willing to put ourselves out there to be sincerely, with a pure heart and without fear or prejudice, ambassadors to these civilizations, because they are out there. And you know what? They're waiting. These civilizations, I think they've been less than pleased with so far the response on balance that humans have had towards them. Because it's either been denial or fear or xenophobia or frank hostility. I mean, the Roswell event was actually an electromagnetic system going off that caused these two craft to hit each other and collide and crash. But a lot of people don't know that. It's an FBI document that pretty much states that it was a new radar dome. Well, the radar dome had some sort of Tesla coil type electromagnetic, circa 1947 electromagnetic pulse. And these two craft that were seeing what we were doing at the 509th Bomb Squadron, which was the only nuclear bomb squadron, atomic bomb squadron in the world at the time, they weren't nuclear bombs and they were atomic. You know the difference, atomic, nuclear? Atomic is fission, nuclear is fusion. Anyway, but it was an atomic bomb squadron, the only one, and they turned this thing on, boom, and these two craft that were going along, one sort of exploded right there northwest of Roswell, the other one descended and kind of cracked in half or broke up near Socorro, and that's where they got the ET that was alive out of it, what they called the EB. So there are two ships. But unfortunately, that was a terrible event. It was a violent event. So a lot of people have said, well, can't the ETs avoid that if they have all these abilities? I said, no, not just because they have advanced technologies does not make them omniscient. So here's another mistake everyone makes. They conflate advanced civilization or more advanced civilization with being godlike. Don't make that mistake. They're just people like us, but very, very advanced. Now, they may have IQs of 450, so I'm a moron by comparison. But, which I will admit, I am a moron by comparison with some of these civilizations, but, or an imbecile. A primate. But nevertheless, it doesn't mean that they become infallible. You know, I think infallibility rests with divinity and the unbounded being, and that's it. Anything this side of it is subject to failure and error, even the archangels. So you just keep that in mind as you look at this. There's not infallibility assigned just because it's very, very advanced. It kind of reminds me of, everyone know what the cargo cults were, World War II? Great story, because this is a great example of the mistake humans make. So in World War II, we were flying, these propeller planes and landing them on islands in the Pacific. And we landed on some islands where there were native peoples who had never seen Western civilization or an airplane. And when we left and then came back and we found that the native peoples had made altars and made things that looked like a biplane with a propeller, and they were worshiping because it was gods that had come from the sky. And it had become, it's like the movie The Gods Must Be Crazy. You know, the guy throws a Coke bottle out the window and the people start fighting over this. So we need to take a step back and say, okay, these are a very advanced civilization. Some of them may be, I think are, 10 to the 7th years, millions of years more developed than we are. And all of them are thousands of years, but many of them are hundreds of thousands to millions of years more developed, socially, spiritually, technologically, than Homo sapiens are. But nevertheless, they're still people. Now, there are people that are very, very advanced, and there are people, some of them are so advanced that they could be mistaken as gods in sort of ancient archaeology and the ancient astronaut sort of concepts. And of course, this makes total sense. I mean, if you have something that appears like that can appear, dematerialize, rematerialize, go straight through objects, it would look like something metaphysical and spiritual. And so there is the beginning of the conflation of very advanced civilizations and technologies with the mythology that becomes sort of a catechism and misunderstanding. So we need to be careful not to make that mistake. We need to say, oh, okay, childhood's end, let's understand this, and approach these civilizations as really advanced civilizations, but because we are conscious and can become in this state of universal consciousness, in that sense, equal. Totally 100% equal, even though we haven't developed all the fine points of functioning yet. I mean, we're more dysfunctional than functional, I think you all agree, as a species, but you know, we can evolve to a higher level of function through conscious development and evolution. And these civilizations understand that. I think, of course, the big concern of the last 75 years has been we start detonating nuclear bombs and hydrogen bombs in the atmosphere and doing things to destroy the biosphere and the oceans. You begin to see, as one British intelligence guy told me, it's like we kicked a hornet's nest because a red flag went up over the planet after we started detonating atomic weapons, that, wow, these people have kind of gotten off the reservation are an existential threat to themselves and potentially others. So that's a perspective I want to bring for just a minute. In the heart of compassion of the Buddha, as it were, is how might humans be viewed? Okay, in the last 100 years, we've killed around 200 million people in warfare and continue to do so. I lived in the Middle East for 3 years, saw plenty of stuff. And that doesn't count just murders, or good old-fashioned homicides. I mean, organized murder, which is warfare. 200 million, well, that's the population of many of these planets that we've just wiped out in a couple generations through fighting over what? An economic system, a religious system, this system, that system. So, but then you combine that, so it's no longer with swords and maces and even muskets, it's with thermonuclear weapons. And in covert programs, these rather fearsome scalar electromagnetic weapons based on these very advanced trans-dimensional sciences. So I think that the civilizations are correct to have some deep concern, and I think they need also to have people scattered around the world, everywhere, who understand these issues and will go out calmly, but with a depth of understanding and a depth of experience, and attempt to make contact that's peaceful and mutually beneficial, which is the whole gist of the CE5 initiative, the Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind initiative. And a close encounter of the fifth kind is simply when humans say, I'm going to make contact as a diplomat and initiate it and allow it to continue, however way it flows. And it may be in this dimension, or it may be trans-dimensional, it may be in thought, it may be in part in this dimension and part in another. And sometimes it all comes together in one night and all those phenomena happen at once. We've been out under the stars where we've had objects that have done electronics, people who've had remote views in their mind where there are 5, 10 people see or hear the same thing, a craft then appears that everyone sees, et cetera, and so on and so forth. Now, because the whole gamish of sort of phenomenon. And then there'll be these beings that are moving around us that aren't physical, but that are shimmering, almost like a subtle hologram moving around the desert or moving around on the beach or wherever we are. Really amazing stuff. And what I've found is that people have expectations that are based on, let's go to Starbucks and have, a croissant and a latte. No. There's other ways that they communicate. And a lot of it is because that's edifying, that's instructive. It opens up another dimension and aspect. And part of it is just practicality. If you're in what's called a hostile theater of operations, using military speak, which would be called Earth, that has space-based weapon systems that are all out there already deployed since 1965. I know guys who designed them. That when these objects fully materialize, will target them with an electromagnetic scalar weapon that goes faster than the speed of light. Believe me, they're not going to, it's not the 50s and 60s anymore where they just would materialize and land everywhere. Now, they do sometimes, but it's risky. So we have to operate with that understanding also. So there's another understanding I want to bring to this that people do not like hearing, but I'm an emergency doctor. You come into my ER with a headache and I find a brain tumor, I'm not going to tell you got a migraine. I'm going to say you got a brain tumor. So here's the deal. We've developed systems that unfortunately are approaching parity transdimensionally with what some of these civilizations have in terms of technology, which means that we are a threat. And also means that, now, not that the intelligence community can't be everywhere at all places at all times, believe me. Unfortunately, when I'm around doing something like this, in all likelihood, it is monitored. But you guys, this is why my whole idea is to squeeze the tube of toothpaste and get it out. And then I become redundant and unnecessary. If I drop dead, doesn't matter. Because you guys can do it, and they cannot keep track of thousands, tens of thousands of people now who understand or attempting to do this. So I think that's the power of the people coming together and decentralizing this operation. And by decentralizing it, it's like decentralizing it away from me and the center of my operation. Because they cannot keep track of all that. So don't make the boogeyman in the intelligence community more powerful than they are. It's a little bit like the Wizard of Oz. The man behind, who's the man behind the curtain, pulling all the levers, scaring the bejeebies out of everyone. And I'm not saying they're a total paper tiger, but at the same time, they're not omniscient or omnipresent, which means that you guys can do this and have some amazing success with contact separate from me being around. My purpose is just to teach and to let people understand how this happens and then go do it yourself. The medical model is see one, do one, teach one. You see it done once, if you're in med school, you see it done once, and then you do it, and the next time you're teaching someone to do it. Boom, boom, boom. So that's the model. And it works, because that's how it propagates. Knowledge propagates very quickly that way. And if you take that to heart, you'll find that you begin to learn these abilities in meditation and the techniques of the CE5 protocols. Go out and do some experiences, and then you have some learning curve, and then you begin to share it with other people. And it just takes off. And we have some great people around all over the world doing this. Like I said, every continent. So that's what I want to encourage people to do and empower you to do it. The other thing I want to share in this sort of introductory, these first couple hours, is the understanding of the mind and all the different ways that our experience can relate to ET manifestations. Now, there's something called, in the Vedic tradition, the siddhis, S-I-D-D-H-I-S. These are different abilities and powers that people can develop as they develop higher consciousness. Now, these run the gamut of almost everything you've heard about, some of which has been relegated to mythology, but is actually very real, such as levitation, dematerialization, materialization, changes in your body density to move through solid objects, precognition, we've talked about, teleportation, telepathy, materialization of objects, etc., and so on and so forth. Now, those are all things that actually humans can do. Those are advanced applications of higher states of consciousness. But understand that there's a scientific correlation to every conscious city. So whatever that you can imagine that any enlightened master has done can be routinized or made routine through a scientific method, even when it up to and including levels of the astral, you may call celestial, conscious cosmos, and do it scientifically. I always tell people that a really hilarious story of this captain of a Navy contract vessel that was in the South Pacific in '63. Jacques Vallée had the story, but he didn't have the source. It was a third-hand story for him, where we were testing I think they were the Atlas intercontinental ballistic missiles. We were firing them downstream in the South Atlantic, and this captain who contacted me was on a ship that was retrieving them after a test fire. Now, these were not hot. They didn't have nuclear weapons on them. They were trying to get the missile to be accurate. But the missiles kept missing their mark, and they knew there was some kind of a subtle electromagnetic thing happening. And there was always an ET craft around. And they got these on radar. So one night, his radar guy, they had a new, I think it was RCA radar system, and it was sweeping around, and they picked up a craft. And so the captain was called, came up, they got it. He called the command center, and they got it on radar. Unfortunately, they then hit it with some kind of electronic weapon or something. And the thing blew up. There was an explosion in the sky, and it fell straight down into the water, this UFO. And the next morning, his ship was vectored into the point of impact. And they couldn't find the ship, but there was about a 6-foot square pod that ejected, that had 4 of the ET beings in it. And this guy was a salt-of-the-earth Navy guy, and he said, well, they were handsome little men, but their skin was the color of a Sicilian. I never forget him saying that, Sicilian. Okay. And bronze-colored, no hair, no pinna, which is the pinna is the flap, the monkey ears we have. They just have openings, fine lips, a sort of small nose. And just like the man that contacted me from Skunk Works at Lockheed about the astral projection experience, this person contacted me to find out something that had bugged him. It stuck in his mind and bothered him for 40 years. And I said, well, what is it? He says, well, we got him out of this thing, this pod. They were ordered to put him in the ship's freezer till a nuclear submarine came along and took them, and they were all threatened with death if they talked about this. He says these little men were in sort of these metallicized fabric. It was almost metal, soft metal-like fabric, one-piece suits. I said, yeah, like a onesie. But it didn't have any buttons or zippers. And he said, how could they have gotten in them? And I said, this is why you're calling me? And it was. This was exactly why he was calling me. And I said, well, I don't know if you're going to like my answer. And he said, well, tell me. I know those damn things, you could have to cut them off, but we couldn't even cut them. I said, well, the way that the suit is made, they just stand into an energy field that has a resonant, and it materializes around them. like 3D printing, but like a 3D zip. So there are no, and it comes off the same way. It dematerializes off and materializes on. But I said, did you notice anything about this thing that they were in that was floating? He said, yeah, it had no pieces. I said the same thing. So I call this sort of a infra-ultrasonic manufacturing, where if you imagine going beyond the speed of light, speed of electrons, beyond the zero-point energy field, and creating sort of a architectural blueprint of a spacecraft that's in that dimension, like an astral, like your astral body, and have that resonate, and it comes into this dimension in toto. So it recruits the atoms, the molecules, the structures, not by digging them up and smelting them and banging them and doing rivets like we do on an airplane, but it, and that's, I call this extraterrestrial manufacturing 101 that I'm sharing with you. So that's why these spacecraft, the guys who I know who've gone to ones that have retrieved them, they're seamless. Now, if you see one that has rivets and seams and parts of it, that's Lockheed and Northrop's and Boeing's anti-gravity stuff. But these, the ET ones, are completely seamless, and the light coming from them is so amazing, it's so pure, you never quite forget it, because the light is coming from a source and materials that aren't manufacturable. You couldn't even manufacture something that pure in space. And there was a part of a craft that they got in Brazil, and I forget, it had magnesium and some other stuff in it, but the elements that were in it were so pure that even in the vacuum of space we could not manufacture it. And no one understood how they could be doing this. I said, because they're not going to some asteroid or planet and digging up stuff out of the earth and smelting it and melting it and then putting it together. They're creating a field, and it resonates and then comes in from that transdimensional, virtual, near astral, I call it, the near astral. And it then pops as a totality into 3D. Make sense? Which, if you study the literature of the craft that have been retrieved and even the clothing on these beings, they're consistently this same report. Now, why is that important? Because it means that when you're out under the stars and you see something, and if it seems just, it's too beautiful to be real, it looks like a jewel. We were once in Colorado and there was an object, it looked like it was a crystalline jewel in the sky. And it was there for a number of minutes, and you couldn't even, it was painful, it was so beautiful. And then there was a fighter jet was vectored in, and the thing popped and began to go off, looked exactly like a 737. Everyone saw it. So, you know, but what's fascinating is the purity of the light and the quality of it. And then there's one more thing. These craft are imbued at the level of nanobiotechnology. You know what that is, nanobio? Where they're actually living and they're conscious. So the craft itself has the consciousness of the occupants, and often it's the chief pilot or the person who's actually directing it, which is usually, they will either touch it and think and they'll go. All right? But the craft itself is not just like a piece of machinery. It's actually living. And there have been more than one military guy I've interviewed who have been on retrieval missions when they get there, and the craft has been injured. I call it injured because it's organic. And there'll be a crack, and it'll be trying to heal. Like if you did a cut and did a time lapse of a healing of a wound on skin, it's doing this kind of thing, trying to fix itself. And so the craft themselves are nanobiotechnology at the level where they then can subsume or take on the awareness of the occupants. And that's how they operate. So many times people have an experience with a UFO, but they'll feel that the UFO itself was communicating or was conscious. I say, well, it is. that it was like this living, organic, conscious thing. And many times people will dismiss it, and I'll go, no, thousands of people have had the same experience. And it's because it is. It is a living, conscious nanobiotechnology at the level that it can then take on the awareness of the occupant or the occupants. But usually it's the main occupant who's the anthropocentrically projecting here captain or the person in charge.